What if the single most damaging piece of advice you've ever absorbed is the instruction to stay realistic? Since childhood, the message has been consistent. Stay grounded, don't expect too much, don't assume you're the exception. It sounds like wisdom. It sounds like the kind of caution a responsible adult offers a child who needs protecting from disappointment. But what if that same advice has quietly extinguished more potential than failure itself? Ever managed to look at anyone who genuinely reshaped the world around them? Before that world believed in what they were building, they believed in it first, often so completely that everyone around them assumed they'd lost touch with reality. Nobody changes anything meaningful by only responding to what already exists. The people who build what doesn't yet exist have to see it clearly before there's any evidence to justify seeing it at all. So the real question isn't whether a given belief sounds unrealistic. It's whether you're willing to hold a belief the world hasn't caught up to yet. Most people misunderstand the actual order of confidence. They assume it arrives after proof, after the results are in and the outcome has already validated the effort. Machiavelli understood something considerably sharper than that. People rarely follow certainty because it comes with evidence attached. They follow certainty because certainty tends to manufacture the evidence that follows it. Belief shapes action. Action shapes identity. Identity shapes what eventually becomes possible, which means, more often than most people realize, the outcome gets decided well before reality has any chance to weigh in. This video draws on Machiavelli's understanding of projected certainty, alongside Nietzsche's writing on self-overcoming, Seneca's discipline around adversity, Sun Tzu's approach to adaptable strategy, and Marcus Aurelius's insistence on separating identity from outcome. 6 truths about why realistic thinking so often traps people, and how deliberate, strategic self-belief becomes a genuine advantage without ever losing contact with what's actually true. Drop this in the comments before we begin. I believe before the proof arrives. Let's begin. Truth 1. Be realistic is fear wearing a respectful costume. Think back to the last genuinely exciting idea you had, the kind that made you briefly forget every reason it might not work. Now think about what actually happened next. Did you pursue it, or did some internal voice, or someone standing nearby suggest being realistic instead? For most people, that voice wins, and the idea gets quietly abandoned before it ever gets a real attempt. That isn't wisdom. It's a trap most people fall into without recognizing it as one. On its surface, realism sounds mature, responsible, grounded, the kind of thing a sensible person says. Examine what it actually produces, though, and a different picture emerges. Realism, as most people practice it, doesn't protect against failure. It protects against ever making the attempt in the first place, and those two outcomes are not remotely the same thing. When the instruction to be realistic gets handed to you, what's frequently being communicated underneath it is, stay where things are safe. Don't reach past what's already been proven possible by someone else. That instruction feels responsible on the surface. Underneath it's simply fear, dressed carefully enough to pass as good sense. Trace how this pattern usually begins. A child voices a genuinely large dream, an ambition that sounds implausible from the outside, and a well-meaning adult, someone who wasn't being cruel, suggests a backup plan instead. That adult was simply repeating what they'd been told at the same age, and the message compounds across generations until caution starts masquerading as intelligence. Here's what rarely gets said clearly. Nearly everything currently in use, from the device you're likely reading this on to the medicine that saved someone you love, was built by a person who refused this exact advice, who looked at a world missing that thing entirely and decided to build it anyway. Nietzsche wrote at length about what he called the will to create, rather than merely to conform, arguing that genuinely significant change has never come from people content to operate strictly within what already existed, but from those willing to hold a vision the surrounding world hadn't yet validated. This pattern doesn't just limit large historic ambitions, it quietly reshapes daily self-perception. Shrinking goals to avoid judgment gradually builds a smaller identity, shifting from someone who creates things towards someone who simply reacts to them. And once that shift settles in, it shows up everywhere. The hand that doesn't get raised, the application that doesn't get submitted, the opinion that doesn't get voiced, all while waiting for a permission that essentially never arrives. Realism has a legitimate place, understanding current resources, recognizing genuine obstacles. That's simply sound judgment. The distinction that matters is between understanding reality and being permanently limited by it. The people who changed the trajectory of entire fields didn't deny reality. They refused to let its current state define what its future state was allowed to become. Drop this in the comments. My vision doesn't need the world's permission yet. Truth 2. Certainty before evidence is strategy, not delusion. Nearly everyone genuinely admired for what they've built shares a specific trait that predates their success entirely. They believed in the outcome before there was any proof to justify that belief. Not after the results arrived. Not once the applause started. Before any of it. From the outside, that kind of belief often looks irrational, even arrogant. From the inside, it functions as something closer to strategy than delusion. Most people assume the sequence runs work hard, produce results, then arrive at confidence. That order sounds logical enough. It's also not how genuinely high performers actually operate. The real sequence tends to run in reverse. Belief arrives first, decisions shift as a result. Actions follow the shifted decisions, and results eventually catch up to all of it. When belief in an outcome is genuine, the choices made along the way change accordingly. More persistence through difficulty, more willingness to search for a solution instead of settling for an excuse, a different energy that other people notice and respond to even without being able to name exactly why. Certainty ahead of evidence isn't wishful thinking in this framing. It functions as the actual mechanism that produces the evidence eventually, gathered in its support. Machiavelli's writing on projected confidence captures this precisely. The person who projects the most certainty tends to hold disproportionate influence over a room, not because they've already solved every problem, but because certainty itself carries a kind of magnetism. People follow it, extend trust toward it, invest in it, often before there's concrete reason to. Doubt operates through a similar mechanism, in reverse. Spend enough time around people who constantly second-guess themselves, and that hesitation transfers, quietly, almost without notice. This is precisely why environment carries so much weight, not because successful people possess some inherent moral superiority, but because the people surrounding you continuously shape what feels achievable. A circle operating from limited, belief slowly lowers the ceiling of what feels possible for everyone inside it. Truth 2. Certainty before evidence is strategy, not delusion. Nearly everyone genuinely admired for what they've built shares a specific trait that predates their success entirely. They believed in the outcome before there was any proof to justify that belief. Not after the results arrived, not once the applause started. Before any of it. From the outside, that kind of belief often looks irrational, even arrogant. From the inside, it functions as something closer to strategy than delusion. Most people assume the sequence runs work hard, produce results, then arrive at confidence. That order sounds logical enough. It's also not how genuinely high performers actually operate. The real sequence tends to run in reverse. Belief arrives first, decisions shift as a result. Actions follow the shifted decisions, and results eventually catch up to all of it. When belief in an outcome is genuine, the choices made along the way change accordingly. More persistence through difficulty, more willingness to search for a solution instead of settling for an excuse, a different energy that other people notice and respond to even without being able to name exactly why. Certainty ahead of evidence isn't wishful thinking in this framing. It functions as the actual mechanism that produces the evidence eventually, gathered in its support. Machiavelli's writing on projected confidence captures this precisely. The person who projects the most certainty tends to hold disproportionate influence over a room, not because they've already solved every problem, but because certainty itself carries a kind of magnetism. People follow it, extend trust toward it, invest in it, often before there's concrete reason to. Doubt operates through a similar mechanism, in reverse. Spend enough time around people who constantly second-guess themselves, and that hesitation transfers, quietly, almost without notice. This is precisely why environment carries so much weight. Not because successful people possess some inherent moral superiority, but because the people surrounding you continuously shape what feels achievable. A circle operating from limited, belief slowly lowers the ceiling of what feels possible for everyone inside it. Nietzsche's writing on self-overcoming touches this same territory from a different angle, describing the discipline required to hold a standard for yourself that exceeds what your current environment has validated, and the specific courage required to maintain that standard while everyone around you is still operating from a smaller one. Genuine confidence changes how a room gets entered, how rejection gets absorbed, and, critically, how long someone stays in a difficult pursuit before quitting. Most people abandon an effort just before the breakthrough, not because options ran out, but because belief did. Drop this in the comments. I move like the outcome is already decided. Truth 3. Ambition is a responsibility, not a flaw. Somewhere along the way, ambition acquired a reputation it doesn't deserve, treated as a character flaw, as evidence of greed or excessive self-regard. As a result, most people learn to shrink their genuine desires publicly, quietly apologizing for wanting more than what's already been comfortably achieved around them. That shrinking costs considerably more than it appears to on the surface. Here's what rarely gets acknowledged directly. Unnecessary self-minimization is just as damaging as unchecked ego, simply in the opposite direction. Continuously downplaying real capability to keep others comfortable doesn't build humility, it builds stagnation. Genuine humility isn't pretending to be less capable than you actually are. It's an accurate understanding of what you're capable of, paired with the discipline to keep pursuing it without requiring applause at every step along the way. Ambition and ego are frequently confused, and the distinction matters. Ego insists the current version of you is already sufficient. Ambition insists on continued growth beyond it. Ego is closed and self-protective. Ambition stays hungry and self-demanding. Nietzsche's writing draws this line sharply, describing a genuine drive to expand and create as one of the deepest currents in human motivation, distinct entirely from the shallow, defensive posturing that ego produces. Treating a real capability as something to minimize doesn't demonstrate modesty. It demonstrates waste. One of the more reliable ways ambition quietly dies is through waiting. For recognition, for the right moment, for permission that simply doesn't arrive on anyone's schedule. Nobody appears to grant that permission directly. Machiavelli's account of how influence actually accumulates makes this explicit. It responds to people who move first and adjust their approach afterward, not to people holding perfectly still until conditions feel sufficiently safe. Seneca offered a related discipline from a different angle, arguing that waiting to feel fully prepared before acting is itself a kind of self-deception, since preparedness, in his account, is rarely something anyone experiences completely before undertaking something genuinely difficult. The practical shift worth making: stop managing ambition as though it needs to be contained, and start feeding it deliberately through study, through proximity to people operating at a higher standard, through treating others' success as fuel rather than a threat. Drop this in the comments. My ambition is a responsibility I honor, not a flaw I hide. Truth 4. Failure is data, not a verdict. Failure, the genuine kind, where real effort produced a result nobody wanted, affects people differently than the smaller, forgettable disappointments of daily life. Handled poorly, it doesn't just slow progress down, it can stop it entirely. The most important reframe available here: failure is not a verdict on inherent worth, it's information about approach. When something doesn't work, the outcome isn't announcing a fundamental inadequacy. It's identifying, with real specificity, what needs adjustment, timing, strategy, preparation, execution. That's genuinely valuable data, available to whoever's willing to examine it honestly rather than personally. The people who recover from setbacks fastest aren't the ones who feel them least intensely. They're the ones who refuse to let the setback define their identity going forward. The disappointment gets felt fully, and then a single question replaces the reflexive one. Not "why did this happen to me?" but "what does this actually teach me?" That shift alone changes almost everything about how quickly momentum returns. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about separating what happens from who you fundamentally are, arguing that external events, including failures, carry only the meaning assigned to them, and that a disciplined mind learns to extract the lesson without absorbing the event as a permanent verdict on character. A lost opportunity doesn't make someone a failure. A wrong call doesn't make someone incompetent. The setback is temporary by nature. Identity doesn't have to inherit that same temporariness unless it's allowed to. There's also a timeline distortion worth naming directly. Genuine growth rarely looks impressive while it's actually happening. For long stretches, it looks like nothing, like wasted effort, like a wrong turn that hasn't been corrected yet. Then, often without much visible warning, the accumulated effort compounds into something undeniable. Most people abandon the pursuit precisely during this invisible phase, mistaking silence for failure and slow progress for no progress at all. Protecting genuine self-worth during difficult stretches doesn't mean pretending everything is fine when it isn't. It means holding high standards for effort and clear judgment about results, while keeping fundamental self-belief entirely separate from both. That combination, rigorous standards paired with protected identity, is what keeps people moving through conditions that would otherwise stop them completely. Drop this in the comments. Failure teaches me. It doesn't define me. Truth 5. Hold the destination tight and the method loose. Commitment to a goal and commitment to one specific path toward it are not the same thing, and this distinction trips up a considerable number of genuinely driven people. A direction gets chosen, effort gets applied, an obstacle appears, and the obstacle gets misread as evidence the entire direction was a mistake. From there, the two most common responses, quitting entirely or repeatedly hitting the same obstacle expecting a different result, are both errors. The strongest performers across nearly any field share a specific trait. They hold their ultimate destination firmly, while treating the specific route toward it as flexible. The vision itself stays fixed. The execution adapts continuously. Sun Tzu's writing on strategy rests on almost exactly this principle. That rigid adherence to a single plan, once circumstances have shifted, produces exactly the kind of predictable failure that adaptable strategy is specifically designed to avoid. When one approach stops producing results, that outcome isn't failure. It's feedback, indicating a different route is now required. History offers considerable evidence for pivoting over quitting. Persistent founders and builders across countless fields have faced rejection after rejection, while refusing to abandon the underlying vision, adjusting the pitch, the timing, the approach again and again, until something finally worked. The destination never moved. The method evolved constantly around it. That's strategic adaptation functioning as intelligence, not as inconsistency or weakness. Most people misread obstacles as stop signs when they're functioning, more accurately, as detours. Every obstacle carries information. A gap in preparation, a flaw in the plan, an opportunity that hadn't yet been considered. Reframing problems as puzzles rather than punishments changes the entire relationship with difficulty. Gracián's writing on practical wisdom emphasized exactly this kind of adaptability, describing rigidity, not obstacle itself, as the actual danger, and treating a mind capable of shifting its approach as one of the most valuable assets a person can develop. The people who succeed over the long term are rarely the most naturally talented. They tend to be the most adaptable. The ones who remain curious when a plan breaks down, instead of growing bitter about the interruption. Staying committed to the destination, while staying genuinely creative. About the route is the actual skill, and it should never be confused with abandoning the underlying purpose altogether. Drop this in the comments. I adapt the method. I keep the destination. Truth 6. Identity is the foundation everything else is built on. Everything covered so far converges on this final point, because the right understanding of realism, genuine self-belief, honored ambition, and strategic adaptability all eventually depend on one deeper alignment. Whether the story someone tells themselves about who they are actually matches where they're trying to go. Without that alignment, none of the previous truths hold together for very long. Most goal setting focuses on acquisition, the money, the recognition, the specific outcome, without asking the more fundamental question underneath it: who does someone need to become in order to genuinely hold onto those things once acquired? That question changes everything, because current habits, language, and daily decisions were built over time to produce the exact life currently being lived. A different life requires becoming a genuinely different person, not performing one temporarily. Language is often the first place this shows up. Listen closely to how a goal gets described. I hope eventually, maybe someday. That language signals uncertainty, and it communicates that uncertainty internally as much as externally. Nietzsche's writing on self-creation treated language and self-conception as deeply linked, arguing that the words used to describe an intended future shape the seriousness with which that future actually gets pursued, shifting from tentative language toward more definite language. I'm building, this is happening, isn't a cosmetic change. It reflects and reinforces a genuine shift in commitment. Daily habits reveal the same gap. Do they actually match the person being aspired to? The space between current identity and intended identity closes through consistent, largely unwitnessed, daily decisions rather than through occasional dramatic gestures. Epictetus made a related argument centuries earlier. That character is built entirely through the accumulation of small, repeated choices, and that waiting for some singular, transformative moment misunderstands how genuine change actually happens. Do enough of those quiet, consistent actions, and confidence eventually stops being something actively pursued. It becomes something simply held, because it's been genuinely earned through evidence accumulated over time. The final shift isn't waiting to become that person once results validate the effort. It's beginning to carry that identity now, before the world has agreed to recognize it, because recognition was never actually the prerequisite it appeared to be. Drop this in the comments. I become the person my future requires starting today. Everyone eventually remembered as extraordinary was, at some earlier point, dismissed as unrealistic. Every organization that reshaped an entire industry was, at some point, laughed out of a room. Every movement that changed how people understood something was, before it succeeded, considered plainly impossible by nearly everyone observing it from outside. The difference between the people who eventually built something lasting and the people who didn't was rarely talent, luck, or perfect timing. It was, more consistently than anything else, the willingness to hold a belief the surrounding world hadn't yet validated. Machiavelli's account of projected certainty, Nietzsche's insistence on self-authored identity, Seneca's discipline through adversity, Sun Tzu's flexible strategy, Marcus Aurelius's separation of self from outcome, and Gracián's adaptability, all converging on the same conclusion from entirely different centuries. This isn't an argument for ignoring reality. It's an argument for refusing to let reality's current state permanently define what its future state is allowed to become. Drop this final affirmation in the comments. I believe before the world agrees with me.